You win.
Hey, we're winning and we are live on the Gamification Revolution. Hello, everybody. I'm your host, Gabe Zickerman, and I'm coming to you today live from beautiful Dubrovnik, Croatia, which, for those of you who don't know, happens to also be the site of King's Landing in the Game of Thrones series. So I'm planning on uncovering all the unique locations that I've come to love in the series. And I'm joined from San Francisco, California, epicenter of all good things technology and the site of Gamification Summit 2013 by Tacy Trowbridge. Hi, Tacy.
Hello.
So excited to have you here, and I'm excited to have all of you with us live, and those of you listening on the podcast, whether that's video or audio. If you're here with us live today, please remember to sign in so you can actually join the chat and you can talk with us in the chat window. You'll see various buttons once you sign in using Twitter or Facebook. The buttons are all around you, and those buttons will allow you to submit a question, and Casey or I will get to that over the next 30 minutes. You can even come on with us by video if you've got questions that you think can be answered about gamification, education, ed tech, and so on. And so, Casey, let's just jump right into it. Okay, so you are
Great.
an educator who's gone to Adobe to work on really super cool educational tech projects that involve engagement, involve gamification, and educators. What is Adobe's role in the ecosystem of education, educational technology, and engagement?
Yeah, it's interesting. So, education has been a really important market for Adobe in lots of ways. I think as we look towards the future, we see a world that's increasingly connected, that's increasingly digital, where in order to have your voice heard, you need to be able to create and to express yourself in a digital format and often in a visual format. And so, as Adobe thinks about the way in which we engage with students, we want to empower them to be creators. We want to empower them to engage effectively in this kind of world. The work that my team does really focuses on engaging and inspiring students and educators and institutions in order that students are prepared to participate in this world and to be successful.
So that's super cool. But I guess it's like, how do you accomplish that in the framework of a company like Adobe? Because we're all familiar with Adobe as the company that makes kind
Right.
of creative tools that you might use, right? Things like Photoshop and Illustrator are probably the company's most famous products, or communication products like Adobe Connect. So what's the sort of idea? How do we actually use Adobe things, or how does Adobe advance this idea internally?
Well, so we work to engage with students in a number of ways. We certainly, some of it is around job preparation. And so career and technical education programs often use Adobe tools, and we work to create curriculum that's up to date so that it's easy for teachers to stay at pace. That, as you know, technology changes incredibly rapidly. It's not that easy for curriculum to change rapidly. So we create curriculum and resources for educators to make that easy. We also have some certification programs that allow students to really demonstrate their skill. So they are learning some of industry standard tools and want to be able to demonstrate that they have the skills that they need in order to get an entry level job. So we run 6 different certification programs that are designed not just around teaching, around learning a tool and how to navigate through a tool, but include some basic design and also some basic project management. How would you work with a client? So those are some of the things that we do in terms of current technical education. We also do quite a bit of work trying to engage and inspire students. So if you think about the way in which students learn, and we've done quite a bit of research into this over the last year or so as we work to really address the needs of our audience, it's clear that students are social, they're really connected, their pop culture is online. It's not the pop culture I grew up with. And so I think part of what that means is that we need to think about engaging with students in the right kinds of ways. So we've just launched a new set of resources for students that's really focused on having students speak in their own voices, to share the work that they're doing, to describe how they're doing it, to help inspire other students, to give them ideas, to show them some of what's possible. And ultimately, we want to give them a platform to share those ideas with each other. So we've featured some students on adobe.com on the student page, but our goal is really to create a long-term community that engages. We do that with educators as well. One of the platforms that we've been building out over the last 2 years is the Adobe Education Exchange. There are 96,000 teachers that are part of that exchange now. It's been a place where Adobe has published a lot of content, and which is amazing. So there, I think almost 5,000 different kinds of resources on the site. But what we've been working on over the last year are ways in which we can make that a place that's social as well, where educators can find each other. You can follow an educator who's doing amazing work, say a science teacher who's working in a similar sort of area, or a teacher like Mike Scotchko who's doing amazing work in gamification. He's gamified his whole classroom and has shared everything that he's done in the Education Exchange. He's a digital arts teacher, but does just phenomenal work. And so I'm glad to have a platform that can increasingly connect people.
It's super cool. And I mean, 96,000 teachers is an amazing collection of insight that other teachers can get to. And we actually put the URL up here. It's edx.adobe.com, so folks can actually check that out. So let's take a slightly different tack and talk a little bit about Level
Yeah,
Up, which is a program that you
sure.
helped innovate. Why don't you tell everybody what Level Up is about if they haven't had a chance to hear you speak about it before?
Sure. So LevelUp is a game that lives within Photoshop, and essentially the problem we were trying to solve was to address that blank screen problem. Sometimes when you come to use a program, you have a specific goal in mind, and you want to figure out the best way to do that. That's which is great. But sometimes if you're learning something and you open it for the very first time, you have no idea what's even possible. And for a tool that's as powerful as Photoshop, often people know what they know, and they don't know what they don't know. So we created Level Up, which functions as an extension within the program to kind of guide folks through a workflow, to show what's possible, to give some early easy challenges that would teach you how to do some basic things in Photoshop, and then to gradually extend that to demonstrate the full capabilities of Photoshop and the kinds of things that you could do. It was designed initially for novices that we thought, great, we want to engage folks who are new. I think one of the things we've learned about students is they're willing to try anything, but they also give up pretty easily. Well, I don't know that they give up easily, but if they can't do what they want, there's so many options that they're on to the next thing. So we wanted to capture their engagement and attention and to help them really understand the power of a tool like Photoshop. So we oh, go ahead, Gabe.
Yeah, so what have been the results that you found from that experience?
Yeah, so we have run it generally, so it's just available for anybody who wants to use it. We did do some pilots within the education space where we were looking at how it might connect to curriculum and wanted to make it flexible enough so that, say, an institution could create their own challenges and tie that to curriculum, and it would support a flipped classroom model. That maybe what you're doing is learning how to use a tool outside of class, and when you get into class, you're focused on design, you're focused on getting feedback, the kind of valuable things that you get face to face, but not so much on teaching how to use a particular tool. I think we've also seen really great social impact from this game. People like to share what they've created and what they've done, and so that's always kind of an interesting thing to watch. In that, what people have learned is something that they care enough about that they want to share that out to their social network. So that's been great. I think one of the things that we've learned is that we've tested it out in a couple of different ways, and this is one of the advantages of working in something like gamification, where everything isn't completely codified and there's room for experimentation. We tried out intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation for this game. Would people participate more? Would they use Photoshop more if there was a extrinsic reward at the end? And in this case, we found not really, that it was the intrinsic motivation that seemed to be more meaningful. People were learning how to do things they wanted to do. They wanted to then share those and to continue to engage around it. Some of the things that we found were that people who used Level Up, not only did they expand their knowledge, but it changed the way they actually engaged with Photoshop. So we were able to look at the way in which people used Photoshop prior to playing Level Up and then after Level Up, and saw that they were using a greater number of tools, they were
Ah,
using different tools, and they were using Photoshop more, which was great. I think what that means is that it provided real value to them, and they were able to learn things that made it a tool that was more useful.
so that's a very interesting kind of maybe not sidebar, actually, maybe bring that to the front. There's one thing about getting people to use it more. It's another thing to get them to
Hmm.
use it broader, to understand more of
Right.
its scope and the possibility of it. Can you talk more about that? Because that seems like a particularly difficult challenge for any
Yeah.
educational context.
Well, and I think one other thing that's related to that, we thought this was a game for novices. What we found is that actually the experts really were interested in playing it as well and moved all the way through the game. I think one of the things that they were interested in was just improving the way in which they worked with Photoshop. So it changed their workflows. Yeah, for me, the things I'm most interested in are figuring out what makes a difference in terms of the ways in which people apply what they've learned. We have many new capabilities now in terms of the kinds of data that's collected for online learning that allow us to try things out, to figure out what's effective, and to look for impact. That's part of what we're interested in with the Education Exchange as well. We've launched a new set of free professional development resources for educators. And part of what we're able to do is try things out, try small things, understand what works and what doesn't. We can also see what educators then share back into the broader community, and that gives us a sense of whether or not we're hitting the mark in terms of really changing behavior. And I think we're interested in changing the kinds of behavior that really support creativity, teaching creativity, inspiring and engaging creativity.
And I think that's a sort of very interesting, kind of dovetails with the question asked by Alexandra Tatz, and thanks for that question, Alexandra, which is about how gamification is different from really good user experience design. And so in the chat, Sasha, who's a regular watcher of the show and also as a speaker at G Summit, talks about how UX design doesn't have to include game mechanics. That's something that's sort of optional. Ivan
Right,
comments that a good UX designer needs to understand gamification. Now, I know that you're coming at it from the perspective of an educator who has the goal of
right.
helping people be creative and experience and know how to do things. What do you think about the relationship between good, let's call it good experience design rather than just like product design
Mhm.
in the narrow sense? And how important is it to understand gamification if you're doing something like building a curriculum or building something that's meant to educate?
Yeah, I think gamification is an incredibly important part of anybody's toolkit when they're designing an experience, whether they're, and it's a, the way we start is we really think about what are the goals, what are we trying to accomplish, and what are the different kinds of ways in which we can engage and inspire our users to learn. If our goal is to help them learn, how do we do that? How do we make that something that people want to do and find valuable? What are the kinds of ways in which we can pull on research into what motivates people, what keeps people going? How can we continue to use some of the strategies that we're seeing really interesting uses of broadly to support learning? I think one of the things we're looking at with the exchange is we're experimenting with badges in terms of trying to create badges that are meaningful, that aren't just a gold star. I think one of the things we found is that if we are just giving someone a badge that's not meaningful, then it actually decreases their engagement. They're less likely to come back. And so what we're looking at are what are the kinds of things that people really want to do, and how can we reward those so that the badges represent something that is meaningful, that is a positive experience for people, that's a good memory, that's something they want to even continue to behave in a certain way, that perhaps they did something once, and a badge can serve as a reminder for this was something that was effective and useful. Come back to this. Try this idea again. I know you've
What
done a ton of work around this as well, but those are some of the things we're doing.
Yeah, so let's talk about meaningfulness for 1 second, right? Because this is an often kind of a regular complaint or concern. And by the way, Alexandra, thanks for that question. Hope to see you back again soon. So let's talk about meaningfulness, right? Because we've used badging systems in educational context. It was used when I was a kid. There were like the little gold stars on
Hmm.
the screen, and we did that.
Right.
I always forget what it was called, but something like SSRI or something SPSS. There was like a series of books that we were not SPSS, books that we read, and they had kind of
Hmm.
badging that went along with them. But so educators have been using badging systems for a long time. So
Right.
what's really the distinction between a meaningful one, right, or what maybe we describe as a kind of throwaway one?
Yeah, so I was talking to an art teacher who's gamified her classroom, and part of what she was describing is that instead of teaching a standard curriculum, she's broken her classroom up so that students can engage in a series of projects. And once they've completed a project, which has a finished result, and there's always a learning objective for the projects, they earn a badge that symbolizes they've completed that. But that's also how they're earning their grades in the class. That instead of it being a system where you start with 100% and you're gradually moving down throughout the semester, she's allowed students to engage around projects that have a result for them. She's also tried to tie that into a real world experience, so there's some broader impact for the work that they're creating. And then the badge represents the successful completion of that project. Much more meaningful than, say, daily attendance, though I know people use badges to monitor attendance. They use badges around behavior, but I think some of the badges that really represent interesting work that students have done, that represent the completion of some important task, that's really much more interesting to me.
So that's very interesting. So talk about completion, we're talking about the significance of the task, but maybe not for
Hmm.
things like attendance. Okay, so I know that this sounds probably a little bit minor, but it's applicable to a lot of parents and the educators out there who are interested in this topic. But how would we gamify attendance? What would we be doing if we actually cared about that? Because hey, if you don't show up,
Yeah.
it's hard to get where you need to go. What kinds of things, if you think that maybe badging isn't necessarily the best way to do that, how might we do that?
Hmm. Well, I think part of what you want to do is make people want to show up, and so you have what happens in a classroom be meaningful, to have real life application. I think collaboration and being accountable to your peers for your presence, that's something that can really drive attendance. I think there are all sorts of things. Certainly, you want to make sure that you know where people are and to reward people who show up. But I think you can also do that by motivating them to show up and creating the kind of environment where students want to be there, where they want to engage, and where they know what's going to happen during the day is both interesting to them and it's meaningful to them.
What do you think about the subject of just kind of coming up and continuing to come up in chat and keeps coming up over and over again as an educator of the word of the concept of gamification in the education context? Don't you think that is there some natural resistance with the educators that you work with, or do you feel like educators in general are open to the concepts of gamification for transforming their classroom? I mean, you've seen more examples than just about anybody
Yeah.
else.
Well, I think people have been using gamification for ages, that it's not a new concept within education. I think the terminology is sometimes new to folks, and I think as um, educators who've been around for a while have certainly seen lots of fads come through. But I do think that the core components of gamification are really relevant in a classroom space. And I think educators who are interested in working with their students and supporting student success in really making school a place that's meaningful for students and inspires creativity, I think then we're seeing them use whatever strategies are going to be helpful. I think there's interest in what does the research say, what's really effective in classrooms, but individual teachers, I think, are pretty open to finding the right kinds of ways in which they can engage with their students. It makes it a lot more fun to teach if your students want to be there and if the work that you're doing is work that's meaningful for them. I think there's also really interesting research that's taking place in the broader education community around what are the best ways in which we can do this, and am interested in what people are continuing to find out about that. So I think about it from two perspectives: from what's happening within the individual classroom. I think in general educators are really interested in what works, in what's going to be effective in their classroom, and I think broadly within the education community and education research there's real serious investigation into what makes a difference in classroom practice. It's always hard to bridge those two, and so I think gamification is kind of in an interesting place where it's accessible to any teacher who wants to try it in their classroom. But it's also something that the education community is really looking at and trying to figure out the best ways to go forward.
Right. Like there isn't, we don't have what you could imagine as a kind of standard gamified math curriculum, for example, for the sixth grade that a teacher can plug and play
Right.
today. It's really a lot of, we talk about at G Summit, we have educators every year who come and talk about what they've done in their classroom. We've had the amazing Amy Baskin this past year from Florida State College who gamified her
Hmm.
remedial English. Tim Vandenberg, who did sort of math in the middle school, Anant Pai, who's doing third grade, fourth grade math and English remedial. All these teachers have kind of taken it upon themselves, see the connections, do some learning for their own, and kind of build something up for their own class that that is meaningful and useful. But at the same time, there isn't something kind of standard that they can sort of pull from. Based on what you're saying, or kind of your role in all of this, do you think there's the possibility for us to have something like that in the near term? Does that even make sense? Is that something that the education community needs to be striving for? And the corollary, are we going to start with things like how do we teach Photoshop?
Hmm. Well, I think so. I'm thinking about Mike Scotchko, who I mentioned earlier, and he's shared everything that he's done on the Education Exchange. So if you go and just do a search for gamification, you'll see all of the resources that he's created. He's really open about what's happening in his classroom. He's had tremendous response from other educators around the world. So he's serving as a model. That he may be an individual teacher who's done something in his classroom. The kinds of things he sees, he runs his classroom. His classroom's open 9 hours a day, and it's never empty. He runs Saturday classes that are optional, and students come. So I think the kinds of things that you're seeing in terms of just engagement are really clear. The results also in student work are amazing. The kinds of things his students produce really demonstrate a deep understanding of the digital media skills that he's teaching. And I think by serving as an example, he's laying some of the foundation for the kind of work that could happen more broadly, where it's not just an individual teacher launching a new project within their classroom. So that's one of our goals, is to try to connect people who are doing interesting work to each other so that they can learn from each other. I think if LevelUp serves as a model, that's great. I would love to be able to help people find tools that are useful in their classrooms. And we've partnered with a couple of universities to try to explore ways in which we might structure LevelUp so that, as I'd mentioned earlier, it serves as a way to flip a classroom. That maybe you're removing teaching some of the technical skills from the classroom in a way that is compelling and interesting to students. And I think the other thing that it allows them to do is really demonstrate the results. So for gamification to have broad appeal, I think one of the things that will be helpful with that is that you can actually see student engagement. You can see what students are doing, what they're completing. You can see how quickly they're doing that. We can get a lot of information around what's effective in terms of teaching and engaging students. And so I think you've go ahead.
Yeah, it's so interesting, right? But it all starts with this exchange that's happening, like on edX at Adobe, and also since you keep mentioning Mike Scotchko, I put his Twitter handle up on the board there. It's at the Mac
Great.
Lab. If you want to follow Mike and find out more about what he's doing, or go to edX at Adobe. So one question, we have a really spirited debate happening in the chat that we're going to get to in 1 second, which is talking about gamification, design principles, and so on. But one question that's been waiting for a while from Beth Case, thanks for the question, Beth, right to you, Tacy, is so LevelUp, amazing, using gamification to help teach Photoshop, help teach Illustrator, admittedly, two of the most complicated pieces of creative software in the world and two of the most powerful. Can we expect to see LevelUp for other Adobe products, A? And B, maybe you can't say, are there any plans in the works to make LevelUp something that other software developers could use and apply to their software and help people learn other kinds of applications?
Yeah, interesting. We're definitely talking about expanding the use of Level Up or something like Level Up, using some of the same concepts to other products. Right now, it's just available for Photoshop, but there's real interest in how do we help our customers really learn this complex software and this really powerful software. So I think we're definitely looking at ways in which we can expand the kinds of things we've learned from Level Up and create learning experiences that are broader across other products as well. And I think we're continuing to look at the ways in which we can embed learning into the product. So that there's a piece about Level Up that's about the gamification strategies that we've used. But then there's also a piece that's really looking at what if you tie learning directly into the product. I certainly visit classrooms where students have two monitors, or they're watching video in one, they're in the product in another, and there's that transition back and forth that's a little bit awkward. So we're looking at ways in which we can really embed learning help within the product as well. And then I think you ask about, would this be open more broadly? Potentially, that's something the Adobe Labs is always doing some really interesting work. That's where Level Up came from, was the Adobe Labs. Then I think we've also got some possibilities around just making sure that we continue to make things available. And the exchange is a step towards trying to incorporate other voices, to allow other people to use our technology and to share what they're doing. So we'll continue to look for ways to do that. So stay tuned. There's some interesting things in the works.
I'm super excited to hear about it. And one of the questions that also been waiting for a while comes from Alicia Sanchez, and she says, which I think is interesting, and kind of kicked off a debate in chat here today on the show, which is that gamification motivates a behavior, and learning isn't a behavior, and therefore
Mm,
gamification doesn't help us directly move learning forward. And of course, there was a big discussion over here from other folks on the side about, well, you need to get the behaviors to trigger learning. My take on this question, Alicia, and then I'm really interested in hearing your thing, Tacy, on this as an educator. My take on it is, for a lot of people, especially for a lot of kids, the desire to learn isn't their problem. It's not that they are intransigent and they come into class going, I absolutely, positively do not understand why I need to understand any of this. I don't want to do any of these things. They don't start from a place of hostility. They're starting from a place of minimally openness to the idea of learning. And so the actual actions are important in fostering that. It's not mutually exclusive from people's motivation to say, oh, well, let's just work on their core motivation. As long as their core motivation is there, they'll find some way to learn. We actually need them to like literally learn some stuff. And that requires us to focus on some of those behaviors, right?
Right. I mean, it seems to me that this is part of what. So I'm also really interested in Alicia's comment and her research, and know that there's a lot that I can learn from that as well. But I do feel like this is one tool. It's one strategy. And so if you think about as an educator, what are your goals? What are you trying to achieve? What do you want students to learn in your classroom? How do you want them to engage with each other? How do you want them to behave? Those are all things that we can use a variety of different strategies to address. And I just think that we've got some new possibilities now that are worth incorporating into a broader teacher's toolkit in the ways in which they are working to engage students, to help them learn, to measure outcomes. I think one of the things that has also been interesting for us is, and a theme recently is really focused on real world application. How do we connect students to opportunities? There's so many more ways in which that can happen now. And that's so it's such a valuable part of learning. So I guess to me, it really comes down to what are you trying to do? What are the best ways to do that? And what are the strategies that you want to use in order to achieve your goals?
Would you agree, though, regardless? I mean, I wrote this book called Gamification Revolution. We were looking at all these different examples of gamification being used, mostly in corporate settings. But often it seems that the uses of gamification, even for marketing of products and also for development of employees, so these kind of big, business category ones, ultimately resolve as learning examples.
Hmm.
They're really about ways of getting customers and employees to learn about the things that are important, learn about how the company makes its products or why they should care about them, learn about how to do your job better. Learning is actually
Right.
closely integrated with gamification, which is part of the reason why there's so much interest in the confluence of these two things in our world. Now, I guess my question for you is, wouldn't you agree that the engagement, just kind of capital E engagement, the idea that a learner is focused on the task of learning, absorbing information, learning how to use tools, wouldn't you agree that engagement is kind of ultimately the necessary precursor that really without that,
Yeah,
we can't actually convey the knowledge we need?
absolutely. I think engagement is key. I would absolutely agree.
So why aren't people just naturally engaged then? I guess as somebody who does this all the time, like why is it that when somebody says, I want to learn Adobe Photoshop, why don't they just sit down and learn it? What's wrong with them?
Well, so I think part of it gets back to something I said earlier, that I think you don't always know what you don't know, and so how do you know what to learn? You may feel particularly passionate. This is something that you want to do, but you don't know how to get started or where to begin. And so I think one of the things that a program like Level Up does is that it scaffolds the learning. It gives you a sense of where to start, where to go next. It helps you continue and maintain maybe that initial interest and potentially build it in directions that you didn't know where it was going to go.
So it's really like this sort of possibilities piece of it, that seems to be so important, like all the different angles that
Mhm.
you can take with it. And I absolutely positively want to say that for those folks who are interested in understanding more about how to foster this education, they really need to check out the Education Exchange, edx.adobe.com, right? And they can find out more about what you guys are up to. Can anyone access the Level Up program? How do they go about checking out Level Up?
It's free. It's a download. If you download it, just so do an internet search, you'll find Level Up. Download it, and then it functions as an extension within Photoshop. So it works on most current versions. So Photoshop 5.5, 6, and then the Creative Cloud version as well.
Fantastic. That's so awesome. And for those of you who are interested in keeping up to date with all the latest things that are happening at Adobe on the education side, you can follow Adobe's education team and Tacy at Adobe EDU. Tacy Trowbridge from Adobe, thank you so much for joining us this week on the
Pleasure.
Gamification Revolution.
All right, thank you.
Thanks for being here. And then thank you. And for those of you who joined us live today, thanks so much for being here. You can follow me on Twitter at gzickerm, and you can always find archives of this particular session and any other sessions at gamification.co/live, which is where we keep the archive of all of our Gamification Revolution shows. And for those of you who will be with us next week, same time and place, Thursday, 1 o'clock, game designer Nicole Lazaro will be joining us, who's unlocked the 4 keys to fun, and you'll certainly want to watch Nicole. I always love to talk to Nicole, so it's going to be a great time. Thanks again, Tacy, and to all of you in the meantime, keep having fun. Take care, everyone.